The forthcoming series introduced here presents a detailed proposal for the constitutional and legislative infrastructure needed for a more just successor system to the present capitalist system. The successor system that we propose is neither one of a stateless, anarchist, localist model, nor any variant of the presently prevalent big government, state capitalist model. The central focus of this series is the achievement of greater social justice.
What we will propose in this series is a system based upon grassroots political economic democracy, extending the rule of law tradition. Its implementation is to be sought in a scaling up fashion, starting on the municipal scale and extending ultimately and sequentially to the county, state, regional, and national scales, and eventually to the international scale. All of these scales of implementation are to be achieved by entirely lawful legislative reform and constitutional amendment means, not by any hyper-costly and failure-prone path of bloody, lawless, violent revolution, which would also potentiate the new dictatorships to which that path tends to lead. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss. We do not claim in any way that what we propose once implemented would produce a perfection or a heaven on earth. Reality is imperfection, but we do hold that the successor system we propose would produce a majority life far better than what the majority suffers today. It would represent, we hold, the next step in the evolution of democracy, in the evolution of human wealth, and in the evolution of collective human happiness. We are consciously seeking, in designing the legal infrastructure for the successor system, to resuscitate the checks and balances and countervailing powers founded in the Constitution of the United States. This design is, in particular, targeted to resuscitate the subverted political checks and balances of the U.S. Constitution, subverted by a hyper-concentration of wealth that can buy out, and that arguably has bought out, all three branches of political government and yoke them all to a singular dictatorial directorate. The way to the resuscitation of these political checks and balances, we hold, is by adding new grassroots democratic economic checks and balances. We are also hereby consciously aiming to achieve a synthesis of the divided and conquered left versus right conflict that has lately engulfed and incapacitated the people and the politics of the United States, of Western Europe, and beyond. Our aim is to present a constitutional and social design for a successor system that will appeal to the majorities of these electorates, right-leaning and left-leaning alike, and that will ultimately prove far more satisfying to their instincts and to their social desires than the traditional models that presently paralyze both leanings. This successor system is designed to be more democratic, more respectful of individual liberty, more in accord with the rule of law, more observant of property rights, and more observant of human rights than capitalism today is, than it ever was, and than it ever even could be. For the sake of clarity, we call this successor system design by the names Generalized Equity and Political Economic Democracy. We call the social, political, economic, and legal process that implements this successor system by the name the Equitarian Reform Revolution. This reform is also a revolution, not in the sense of violence in the streets, but in the sense that, if implemented by the legally expressed will of the majority, it would change the fundamental socioeconomic relationship of the majority of individuals in our society to their sources of livelihood. That's what we mean by revolution. Change in the underlying social relations by which people live. This reform would change their primary social relation from that of capital-only equity. That exclusive form of equity means, for a tiny minority, the ownership, for example, of financial shares in the assets, hence profits, of capitalist enterprises. But for the majority, it means a primary social relation of wage labor or of salaried labor in enforced servitude to that capital equity and to its profitability without any share in that profitability. This revolutionary reform would change that primary social relation to that of generalized equity. That means a system of all citizens, universal, inclusive equity, properties, and rights, by way of instituting 3 new additional forms of all citizens' equity. It also means not outlawing, but including, and also containing the downsides of the old kind of equity, capital equity, equity for capital owners only. The social impetus that has led us to this design is part of a growing recognition of the increasing failures of actually existing capitalism. We're not talking about the idealized capitalisms of the capitalist ideologues that involve perfect competition, etc. That model cannot really exist. We're talking about actually existing capitalism. We will, in the course of this series, delve deeply into the many dimensions of those growing failures of actually existing capitalism. These failures include the imposition of ever more severe global recessions and depressions, and the promulgation by the capitalist ruling class of a people are pollution ideology that puts the majority of humanity in their crosshairs. We will also introduce you, perhaps for the first time, to the dynamical law of motion of this actually existing capitalism. The dynamic that unifies these many problematic dimensions as their singular, albeit difficult to discern, root cause. We name this law the law of the tendency of the rate of reproduction of capital. By capital reproduction, we mean the continual production of and investment of past profits in new, for example, fixed capital plant and equipment to replace the old fixed capital that has been consumed in the process of production or that has been competitively, technologically made obsolete. By the rate of that reproduction, we mean the periodic ratio of the new capital value added to the old capital value already accumulated and demanding its equitable share of profits. This series will also introduce you to the concept of an ascendance phase of the capitalist system, followed by its descendant phase. The former ascendance phase is already behind us in history past. The latter descendance phase is the phase that surrounds and permeates and dominates our lives today, whether we know it or not. During the ascendance phase, now past, the tendency of that rate of reproduction of capital was to rise. From the beginning of the descendance phase, which now engulfs us, the tendency of that rate of capital reproduction is to fall. In response, the owners of concentrated capital threatened, due to that waning rate of reproduction of their capital, with the non-reproduction of their power, and due to that loss of power, threatened also with the loss of all of the perks of their rule, thereby, of course, institute largely in stealth mode, extreme measures in an attempt to reverse that fall, unfortunately in ways that threaten the livelihoods and the very lives of the majority class. A key aspect of this descendance phase and of its specific law of motion is the growing tendency of descendance phase capitalism to drive towards state capitalist, police state, state terrorist, and totalitarian, genocidal, permanent war, national security dictatorship. George Orwell perceived this tendency with unsurpassed clarity. He warned us about it in his famous novel, 1984. President Eisenhower, of course himself a former general of the U.S. Army, also perceived this threat. He warned the people of the United States in his presidential farewell address of the danger to democracy inherent in the emerging military-industrial complex, his name for it. Some symptoms of this tendency to totalitarianism include a declining investment in public education and a dumbing down of what education remains, an increase in punitive social control, such as escalating rates of incarceration, and in police militarization and armed forces imperial militarism, an increase in internet censorship of all forms of free expression, an increase in the seemingly permanent military invasion of other nations by the United States, and an increase in the electronic surveillance of all citizens' communications and financial transactions without even the slightest pretense of probable cause justification. In the transition from feudalism and monarchy to capitalism, in the fight against the brutal, frugal ancien regime, and in the early history of capitalism, during capitalism's ascendance phase, many capitalists fought heroically for greater individual liberty. They fought for the expansion of suffrage and ultimately for universal adult suffrage, for freedom of speech, for freedom of the press, for the right of the people to bear arms as a potential check against abuses of power by their government, for freedom of religion and prohibition of the establishment of any religion by the state, for the rule of law as opposed to arbitrary rule by aristocratic kings and cults of personality, for human rights such as the right of assembly of citizens to petition their government for redress of grievances, for trial by juries of peers, for the right to privacy, and for the right to the protection of liberty and property by due process of law. But with the turn into the descendance phase, the most powerful faction of the ultra-wealthy capitalist ruling class seems to have turned against all of this and appears to be driving toward dictatorship. We will, in this series, trace back to the root cause of this turn, finding it in the law of motion already mentioned. This tendency to totalitarianism is rooted partly in a corollary of that law of motion, in its subsumed law of capitalist competition. Competition leads not primarily to the reproduction of competition, but to the negation of competition, to oligopoly and to monopoly. Extreme capital wealth ownership concentrates increasingly and into ever fewer hands. And those ever fewer hands may act to undermine the political checks and balances that alone, when they function as intended, help mightily to protect democracy from degenerating into tyranny. But with sufficient concentration of gargantuan capital monetary wealth, the ever fewer owners of that wealth can buy out all three political branches of government in a hostile takeover, overriding the intended intermutually restraining and countervailing powers of those three political branches of political government. The houses of legislature, become houses for the rubber stamp approval of the agendas of the owners of that hyper-concentrated capital wealth. The also compromised executive branch becomes an agency promoting the interests of those ever fewer and ever more dominant capital owners against the interests of the majority. The judiciary branch becomes an enforcer of the interests of that same capital-controlling hyper-minority. The quote-unquote free press, the media in general, also owned and controlled mainly by that oligarchy, become agents of the propaganda and of the divide and conquer ideologies engineered by that plutocratic 1% of the 1%. These ideologies are designed to psychologically impair and to disempower the majority class. Race, religion, and any other discernible differences within the majority population become means for these media to balkanize the population into ever smaller divisions, with mutual hatreds cultivated by those media among them all. This hyper-concentration of capital equity wealth ownership, this growth of oligopoly and monopoly, contains the potential for the subversion of the political checks and balances that preserve liberty. However, they do not fully explain, in our view, why the strongest faction of the ultra-wealthy seems to have opted to use that potential to actualize dictatorship. While it is true, in our view, that power tends to corrupt, and that absolute power corrupts absolutely, we think that this concentrated power of the uppermost capitalists is not sufficient to explain what has happened and what is happening now. We detect something more desperate in the uber-ruling class reaction to their potential for near absolute power. We will address, in this series, the root cause of that desperate anti-democratic agenda as well. To do so, we will have to unearth much of the hidden history of the late 19th century and of the 20th century. The three pillars of the successor system that this series will present, each of which is to be both a newly recognized fundamental, constitutional, human right, and also a new kind of constitutionally protected, universal, all citizens property right, are named by us: 1. Citizens' externality equity, 2. Citizens' birthright equity, and 3. Citizens' stewardship equity. These new constitutional rights and their new enabling institutions are designed to advance both the liberty and the prosperity of the vast majority of the population, and to provide risk management to the individuals and families making up that majority against the market failures and the other mortal hazards to which contemporary capitalism increasingly exposes us, but against which it offers us no effective remedies.
Hi, welcome to this question and answer session about generalized equity. My name's Chad.
My name's Bruce.
And we just developed some preliminary sort of expected FAQs, or frequently asked questions, that we think that listeners and viewers may want answered. And but we do encourage you to, if you come up with any other questions that we have not anticipated, to please either email us or post the questions in the comment section below, and we will try to respond in kind.
Incivilities excluded.
Right, yeah. Trolls will be ignored. So, Bruce, how would this new system impact individuals?
Excellent question. An individual citizen of the majority class would no longer be just capital fodder. valued only for work that makes profit for capitalists, and otherwise discarded. Each individual would be a valued part of the community with material proof of that valuing in the form of a citizen birthright equity social trust fund, personal to that individual citizen, plus a right to pursue a stewardship equity alternative to a wage or salary relationship to that citizen's livelihood, and a voting right to limit the imposition of pollution, etc., externalities upon that citizen by capitalist or stewardship enterprises.
So it's an expanding of constitutional rights and a safety net for everybody.
Exactly. I mean, each of these three pillars is simultaneously a newly recognized and newly constitutionally established human right, and also a new kind of property right. It's not always a personal or private property right. It's sometimes a collective or social property right, but it's a universal kind of property that all citizens, whether they own any capital or not, own.
So an expansion of the public commons, or at least a legal expansion of public commons, because these things are already, I hate to use the prescriptive should, but should be, right?
I think there's a widespread recognition that there are some new rights and new kinds of ownership that need to be recognized. It's kind of an intuitive perception that I encounter in a lot of people, but I think what it needs to get going is an explicit legal formulation that can be part of a constitution and part of a new layer of national law.
Do you think data rights should be included in this as well?
I definitely think there needs to be what I would call a right to privacy extension to the Constitution, a more explicit separate amendment that would facilitate the three pillars and the re-democratization of our society, that would explicitly grant extensive privacy rights in the digital age to citizens, to all citizens.
Have you heard of the recent patent awarded to Microsoft that they now have the exclusive patent rights that allow them an intellectual property over extracting biometric data from individuals? So basically, our brain waves, our speech patterns
are their property.
Are the intellectual property of Microsoft under this new patent.
I think we need a Supreme Court. I think we need a Supreme Court that would declare that unconstitutional. And I think we may need to have a long-term but term-limited national election for Supreme Court justices as part of the equitarian reform.
Yeah, there's been a lot of talk about Supreme Court reform, especially in the Trump era, and the massive reaction of the Democrats to the appointees of Trump,
especially now replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Right. Yeah, and this most recent development has reawakened that debate
with a vengeance.
Yeah, and but there have been some, I think, fruitful debates about possible reforms to the Supreme Court, such as term limits, such as democratizing them more, making them elected. The only reservation I would have about that is that the Supreme Court is supposed to be sort of a check on some of the weaknesses of a representative democracy may have. So.
We certainly don't want a majoritarian dictatorship that violates the rights of minorities. We need a certain stability in the Supreme Court to militate against overreach by the majority and to defend minority rights. But I think that could still be accomplished by applying a principle that throughout the pillars of generalized equity in our presentations is applied to other cases. It needs to be moderated to a degree for the Supreme Court, I think. But it's that there should be term limits on Supreme Court justices. They should be very long, maybe 20 years, maybe a generation.
I've heard 16 years, and I thought that number sounded good.
Goes with a 4-year presidential election.
Yeah, it would kind of coincide with.
And I think they should be recallable. And I think they should be recallable by a national petition campaign that gathered enough votes. It should be a high bar for that petition gathering to declare a recall election for Supreme Court justice, but I think it should be possible to recall. And I think also that the Supreme Court justices should be mandated. And what I mean by that is that when they file for election as a justice of the Supreme Court, they should be required to make a statement about the general view they have of the Constitution and of law that gives a sense to the electorate of how they will judge cases.
But shouldn't they also have the ability to change their philosophy as they mature on the court?
Yes,
that's
happened a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Some
important.
justices have been appointed by conservative presidents and then shifted more towards the center or to the left as they're on the court longer, or vice versa.
As I see it, and other people define mandates differently, but as I see a mandate or a kind of a prospectus of how somebody plans to vote or rule or judge, the mandate is not binding. But if the electorate is unhappy with the deviation from the mandate on the part of a justice, for example, then they can mount a recall campaign. But if the electorate is fine with the evolution of that justice's views, no problem. Violates the mandate, no problem.
Great. On to the next question. How would the new system impact business?
Another excellent question. Citizens would have an option to pursue what I'm calling collective self-employment and collective entrepreneurship via stewardship equity, via the third pillar of generalized equity, as well as to pursue traditional capitalist wage work and salaried work relationships with remaining capitalist firms. We're not talking about outlawing capitalism, creating black markets, trying to have a police state that will enforce the outlawing of private property, or none of that. Capitalism is still in place after these reforms, but it has to compete with institutions in which workers themselves democratically decide, with stewardship cooperatives in which workers decide how they'll be treated. So if the capitalists want to treat workers really badly, if they want to get into a race to the bottom, they may have trouble accessing the labor market because they'll be competing with firms that are run by workers. And the economic checks and balances of market competition would also be conserved. Very important aspect of generalized equity. Market competition is a check and balance on the abuse of customers. And, based on the experience of, for example, the Soviet Union and the poor quality of customer service and the poor quality of products that burgeoned under that state monopoly capitalist system.
I mean, you can see that with certain government agencies in the United States that don't have that pressure on them, and then their level of service is degrading.
They become horribly abusive.
You go into social services and things like you go in to apply for food stamps, and it feels very degrading and dehumanizing to.
So we want the stewardship cooperatives to compete among themselves and to compete with remaining capitalist firms, so that they can't get away with that kind of abuse. And in fact, this generalized equity reform revolution would expand competition because there are new kinds of players being created. Even private capitalist firms, when they become oligopolistic or monopolistic, become very abusive.
Oh, absolutely. Comcast.
Oh, great example.
Have you ever tried to deal with their customer service?
Oh, my. And, they've gotten a little better because people started cord cutting. Yeah. But they're still
even to
bad.
Get to a person is a hassle. Once you get to a person, then it's they're pretty good. But
some people
their automated system is
is like
a labyrinth.
Person proof.
Yeah,
getting to a person proof.
You have to scream at it.
And some people have romantic notions that workers are perfectly ethical, moral people, and that they would never abuse customers. But I don't think so. I think if they were in a monopoly position, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power tends to corrupt absolutely. So I think we need to have competition conserved in this new system.
All right. So what would the status of private property be under this successor system?
Of course, I already touched on that.
Yeah, you touched on that. But
private property rights would be retained, not outlawed. And they would also be supplemented by new kinds of property rights that would be all citizen property rights, universal property rights, not limited to the owners of large amounts of capital. These would include the collective property right of externality equity voting rights, and these would also include the new personal property right of citizen birthright equity trust funds, and these would include the social property rights, such as the right to stewardship and the usufruct of the means of production of a socialized producers cooperative per the stewardship equity property right. And these would also include the individual property right of a steward of a stewardship cooperative in the ownership of that steward's individual membership in that stewardship collective, which could not be removed without due process of law. Because that personal or that individual property right gives each steward who forms or is inducted into a stewardship cooperative the right to two streams of income. The an equal share in the net operating surplus of that cooperative every month, and then compensation for time worked in accord with the skill level of that individual.
Would the collective property rights extend to traditional public commons, such as water sources and public lands, like designated wilderness and things like that? Would the people have more of a say in, would these amendments? Do you envision them extending to those areas? Because as it stands, a lot of public lands are subject to extractive industries based on nothing more than the whims of whatever executive policy is in place. The executive branch policy is in place.
And recent Supreme Court decisions have extended the right of eminent domain into a corruption of that says if a private corporation can make profit by expropriating your property with the help of the city government or the county government or the state government, they have a right to do so. So it's no longer it's a public purpose that has to be served before people can be expropriated under eminent domain. It's now the private profit of a private corporation that can drive this abuse of eminent domain. So I think the generalized equity draft statutes and constitutional amendments as written don't explicitly enhance those rights. But I think we should consider, at least in one episode in the future, how we could incorporate that into the generalized equity legislation and amendment content.
Because what you speak to also goes to how the courts have been captured just as executive regulatory agencies, executive branch regulatory agencies, and so forth.
It's inevitable, I think, in a system like capitalism, where, as Marx says, one capitalist kills many, where competition leads to oligopoly and monopoly, not to the reproduction of competition primarily. It's inevitable.
It's the same logic. It's this linear mechanistic logic that just keeps getting extended to new areas.
More and more capital, and therefore more and more money in ever fewer hands. And under those conditions, there's always the potential for a hostile takeover of the state, of all three branches. And when all three branches are owned by the same people, the checks and balances, the political checks and balances among the different branches, the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the legislative branch, no longer work. And that's the situation I believe that we're in now. And that's
they're barely
one of the
working.
reasons.
I think there's still some struggle. There's still a little bit of I think there's some hope there.
But I think you can see the handwriting on the wall.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I think we need to take action soon before it's too late. And a large part of the motivation for the formulation of the generalized equity reform revolution has been to mitigate and to overcome that takeover of the state by ever fewer hands, by ever smaller numbers of families, whose interests are increasingly, I believe, hostile to the interests of the majority class.
Well, because under their plan, they're looking towards this, this completely technological society in which the majority of people are redundant. They're not useful under the system.
And in fact, they're a threat to the power of these ever fewer families because they might revolt.
Absolutely, if they're given nothing,
or they might invent fusion power, and then the techno depreciation of the entire petroleum industry would rapidly occur, and the capital base on which the power of these few families ultimately rests would be obliterated.
And perhaps that's why it seems like there's an acceleration of the agenda, as they're racing against that possibility.
They've already had a few people invent working fusion reactors who had little accidents.
So maybe we can link to some information about that below. I would love to go into that some more, but that is a nice segue into the next question, which is, what is the extent of government reform that would have to occur to institute this new system?
As I see it, for the United States, the reforms would extend constitutional amendments, would extend to several constitutional amendments, plus the institution of a new intermediate level of law in the form of an enabling law constitutional annex. The latter would be less difficult to amend than the Constitution, but more difficult to amend than a congressional statute. And we will make our drafts that already exist for the proposed amendments for the equitarian reform and the proposed constitutional annex. We'll make those public in the course of this series.
Great.
But the reason for the need for this new layer of law is that there's going to be a big fight. Even if there's a tremendous majoritarian support for something like these generalized equity reforms, the very moneyed, very powerful few families have a tremendous armamentarium around them. They're going to do everything they can to resist and to undo what popular movements, majoritarian movements, achieve in regard to these constitutional amendments. So if the enabling legislation is simply at the level of statute law, they could arrange to buy a fleeting majority in Congress and overturn the enabling legislation and undo the accomplishments of that popular movement. So we need to have that intermediate layer to make that less possible.
Great. So what level of consensus would people have to achieve to make this system happen?
Again, for the United States, the majority class would have to become convinced, despite all of the plutocracy's media opposition and the plutocracy's engineering of divide and conquer ideologies, that not theoretical, perfect competition, heaven-like capitalism, but actually existing capitalism is failing and must fail because of its inherent nature, and that what we call revolutionary reform is necessary in the form of the constitutional amendments and enabling legislations, for example, that constitute the equitarian reform revolution.
What organizations do you see standing in the way of implementing this new system?
Basically, everything funded by the tiny 1% of the 1% plutocracy that increasingly rules our society and has very terrible plans for the rest of us. All of the organizations that are the organs of the increasingly democracy-subverting, plutocratic, dictatorial rule of the minority class of dominant capitalists, in other words. These include some organizations that are secret and some that are public, including the major mass media organizations, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Rockefeller's New York Council on Foreign Relations, the Ford Foundation, the so-called Democrat Party, the so-called traditional Republican Party, etc. They also include large swaths of the standing bureaucracy that survives any national election in the federal executive branch and that typically represent the growing proto-police state infrastructure of our government. For example, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, various black ops organizations, and the industries and lobbies which prosper off of the burgeoning national security state and military-industrial complex, as well as Pentagon-equipped, hyper-militarized local police forces.
I would add to all of those the foundations that you were talking about. The Gates Foundation has become one of the biggest players in the anti-democracy, like philanthropy scam movement to push these global corporations that are, largely owned by, the one of the big organizations now that's kind of like vacuumed up all of these big corporations is Vanguard, and it's, these financial institutions. But the Gates Foundation is a big money driver of this agenda. One of the biggest, it's I think probably eclipsed the Rockefeller Foundation in power and
cooperates and continues their tradition. It's no accident that Bill Gates is a scion of a Rockefeller eugenics family, And he seems to be seamlessly, as you've noted, continuing on the program or pogrom of the Rockefeller faction of the ruling class,
Yeah.
the dominant faction, until Trump started to challenge them.
Pushing these, like pushing the agendas of the, these World Health Organization and other United Nations organizations.
The United Nations, I think, should also be realized to be a U.S. ruling class controlled institution running their agenda.
Right. There are some organizations within the UN, though, that have historically had some independent and pro.
That's true of the U.S. government
people,
as well. There are little eddies that are able to resist for some time.
Yeah. But largely, Bill Gates has subverted the World Health Organization's, agenda and pushed it towards, this pharmaceutical model, and he's pushed things like what they call the Green Revolution in India and Africa that's resulted in desertification and devastation of ecosystems.
And a lot of profit for the Rockefeller oil companies.
Hundreds of thousands of farmers in India and
suicide.
Yeah.
And also the United Nations, pushes the people are pollution version of environmental protection, and pushes global warming austerity.
The IPCC. The whole idea, and that's the extractive industry, subversion of climate science towards this CO2 model, which allows them to then commodify CO2 and make profits off of environmental pollution and degradation and the destruction of ecosystems, and
drastically lower the living standard all over the world if they're successful.
Absolutely, yeah. Which then allows for their agenda to spread.
Good point. The Gates Foundation belongs on this list.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thanks for joining us today, and we will be back with episode 2, which will focus on citizens' externality equity, and we hope to see you soon.